President Donald Trump's decision to cut funding has been felt across Africa, UN agencies and NGOs. The World Food Programme is now the latest to close its Southern Africa office. This happens as the region is facing one of its biggest droughts in decades. Let's unpack the impact of this decision with Professor Patrick Bond. He joins us from the University of Johannesburg. Professor Bond, good to have you with us on the show. Thanks for coming on. I mean, it's devastating, isn't it? We've had a discussion with the Treatment Action Campaign today about the funding cuts in the sector, the treatment of HIV, the escalation we will likely see as a result in infections and in deaths. Where do we begin to unpack the reasoning behind this decision by the US president?
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. It's great to be with you and your viewers. The dilemma, of course, is that the major contributor to the droughts and the forest fires, the flooding, the extreme weather, is the United States of America, the historic #1 emitter. The irony is that instead of paying a climate debt and actually giving more money to the World Food Programme to help us withstand droughts and extreme weather, we're instead getting the disconnect both in defunding the World Food Programme and in denying climate, and that means dropping out of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the logic is the effective Prime Minister of the United States named Elon Musk from our own Pretoria, Johannesburg, Durban childhood, and he's turned absolutely monstrous in cutting everything he can, including that PEPFAR program, USAID, and now many others dropping out of the World Health Organization, just as we're seeing an upsurge in potential pandemics, and even in the US, a measles outbreak that's very frightening. Yeah, it's an exceptionally destructive time with the United States at the core.
And I suppose the facts, as you've outlined them, Professor Bond, don't really appear to matter much to the US president. The fact that the US actually needs to be putting back more insofar as damage to the climate is concerned. Washington, as we know, insofar as the World Food Programme is concerned, provides nearly half of its about $10 billion budget. 26 million people now across 7 countries in the region in the south face severe food shortages ahead of the harvest in May.
It's true. And, you know, this is also the time of fiscal austerity. South Africa, 18% cut in state funding per person between 2020 and 2026, as the International Monetary Fund has been squeezing our finance ministry and telling them to run a primary budget surplus. So this is the case for all of the other countries in the region. Zambia even went bankrupt a couple of years ago. So I would worry that the necessity of climate adaptation, of climate proofing, is just unable to be financed. And the Europeans are also pulling back. The Brits are going to spend much more on arms because, of course, Donald Trump is also pulling back from support for Ukraine.
And I suppose the question of getting climate ready is one that we are late in answering, aren't we? I mean, we should not be as crippled as we are by this US decision. We should be more prepared.
Oh, yes, and we've been getting the signals. I mean, we had 500 people who died on April 12, 2022 in Durban because there wasn't good stormwater drainage and the bridges, the roads, they just weren't prepared for the onslaught of a 350 millimeter in one day, so-called rain bomb. And then we've just seen that the last few days in Gauteng, and we've seen it with the droughts in parts of the country that, for example, led to dramatic increases in locusts. So, you know, the US government was supposed to be chipping in on all of these fronts. And now Trump has not only walked out of UN climate, but has also withdrawn the funds. And it's really an important question with South Africa hosting the G20. Shouldn't we be punishing the US collectively, not standing up one by one, because then you get knocked down. But as the Canadians and the Mexicans are doing the last couple of days, as many countries, the Hague group of countries led by South Africa standing up at the International Criminal Court to defend the ICC against US sanctions, to work collectively. And we do have a G19 that could say to the US, if we had the guts to do so, footset, because the role of the US internationally in climate and public health and this emergency aid, humanitarian support, food aid, it's now exceptionally negative. And I think there needs to be punishment.
And to that end, Professor Bond, is this the opportunity now for organizations like BRICS, as you've just mentioned, to finesse and perhaps tweak our trade agreements?
Well, I'd love that because, we do have an Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, but the vested interests mean it's actually not happening as anticipated. And the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act is very certainly going to be withdrawn. And that means our automobiles, steel, aluminium, petrochems are threatened. They're also threatened by climate sanctions next year from Europe and the year after from the UK. But it's time to think about new markets. The BRICS have been disappointing. We were expecting a de-dollarization. Donald Trump even was threatening 100% tariffs. He thought there was a de-dollarization. It doesn't seem to be happening. Lula, who's the host, the Brazilian president, Lula Ignacio da Silva, has hinted we might get back to it. But you see, if Russia and the US have a rapprochement, as it seems to be, then that's the real driving force to get an alternative to the dollar, Russia, because they'll probably be brought back into the interbank system called SWIFT. And then there's the biggest question of all, which is, can we get alternative multilateral institutions? Maybe the US will pull out of the World Bank and IMF. Elon Musk suggested last Saturday pull out of NATO and the United Nations. We may have to move the UN to Nairobi from Manhattan. There's lots of processes now in flux, and I think it's the time to be ambitious and think about a just order. After all, we have a G20 slogan, which is solidarity, equality, sustainability. Donald Trump's regime is the opposite, and that's why Marco Rubio, the foreign minister, wouldn't even come to visit us in Joburg a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, in fact, the president has said in as many words that this is completely antithetical to what he sees as the priorities of the G20. So what now, Professor Bond, for these many countries, these many millions of people who are impacted by this decision to freeze aid? What does the next year or years look like?
Well, it's, first of all, the most frontline apparent victims. We're not sure what's going to happen in Ukraine, but it would certainly be those who are opposed to the invasion. It'll be Palestinians, especially in Gaza, but also the West Bank. It'll be the Burmese. The Rohingya have just had their aid cut, and half of that big refugee camp in Bangladesh, people are starving. It'll be all kinds of people who've been oppressed, and USAID has given them a little bit of money. But as you say, AIDS, people who are HIV positive, the food program, all of this represents an opportunity for us to rethink dependency upon the US government, because it has gone too far. And the neoliberal and regime change characteristics of US imperialism under the Democratic Party, which is certainly cannot be denied, and now this more extreme, what we could call paleo, Stone Age conservatism, paleoconservatism. I do think it means a BDS USA, a boycott, divestment, sanctions. People are already doing it, aren't they, with Teslas and Starlink and X.com. There's a lot of opposition, particularly to the way Elon Musk is managing a great deal of this extreme budget cutting.
It is. It absolutely is an opportunity to rethink dependence on the US government and US aid, but perhaps an opportunity we should have taken collectively, as you say, Professor Bond, many years ago.
Well, particularly because the African Union, as of 2023, is a member of the AU. And so the choice really for the presidency, as they even said just after the announcement of Gaza ethnic cleansing, literally hours, let's have a game of golf. And we know Donald Trump's a cheater at golf. His nickname Pele, because he kicks the ball when he hits it into the long grass, into the rough. He kicks it into the fairway like Pele, the great Brazilian. Or you could go up one by one and try to oppose him. And you saw Vladimir Zelensky doing that and really getting beat up. And then you could go collectively. And I think the Hague Group is a good model for doing so, because it is something that Trump got very angry at, that the International Criminal Court, which has arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu, now is something that Trump doesn't want to see anything of, and is punishing South Africa, particularly by cutting the PEPFAR program for AIDS medicines. So it does signal that there is some strength in numbers.
Professor Patrick Bond, pleasure talking to you this afternoon. Thank you for giving us your time. Professor Bond is the Director for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg.